Just a nurse. That's what they called her in the break room, spoken soft enough that she'd hear it, loud enough that she'd know they meant it. Katie Rodriguez clocked in at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the fluorescent lights humming their electric lullaby overhead, and the veteran nurses at the station didn't look up from their charts. One of them, Marlene, who'd been at Seattle General for 17 years, slid a stack of assignments across the counter without making eye contact. The worst patients. The longest rooms. The night shift everyone else had refused. Katie took them without comment, her slight limp favoring her left leg as she moved toward the locker room, shoulders slightly hunched in a posture perfected over months of invisibility. The faded 3rd Special Forces group patch was still there, tucked inside the lining of her jacket where she'd sewn it with field medic precision the night of her discharge. Her fingers found it before every shift, traced the embroidered insignia in the dark of her locker, a small ritual that had become almost prayer. 12 years. 3 tours. 2 continents. A femur shattered in San Juan Valley that still ached when the weather turned. Her fingers moved across the patch once, twice, then released it. Time to become invisible again. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and the faint metallic undertone of old blood that never quite washed away from the tile grout. Katie moved through Seattle General's corridors at 11:02 p.m. with the kind of economy of motion that only field experience teaches, nothing wasted, everything purposeful, feet knowing the fastest routes between patient rooms before her conscious mind had mapped them. A ventilator wheezed somewhere behind closed doors. The heart monitor from Bay 3 beeped its steady rhythm, the sound of a body that hadn't given up yet. She checked the admit board, 12 new patients since shift change, 2 of them still waiting for rooms, 3 flagged for behavioral observation. The hallway near the service elevator was dimly lit, the kind of forgotten corridor that existed between departments, where maintenance had stacked old equipment and the cleaning crew rarely looked twice. That's where she found him. The wheelchair was pushed against peeling paint the color of old teeth, and the man in it had the stillness of someone who'd stopped expecting help to arrive. The admission bracelet on his wrist read Colonel Webb, admitted 6 hours ago for pulmonary assessment, no assigned room yet, no nurse assigned to check on him. The timestamp on his chart said 5:43 p.m. It was now 11:53 p.m. 4 hours and 17 minutes of waiting in a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and decay. Katie's jaw tightened. Not a visible clench, not a break in composure, just the small muscle contraction that was her tell when something triggered the old memories. She knew that face. She knew the arrangement of features that had sat behind a court-martial table in a forward operating base outside San Juan, signature on discharge papers that read medical and psychological unfitness for active duty in his precise military handwriting. The officer who'd presided over the end of her career, back when she was still Major Catherine Rodriguez, back when her hand still held the lives together instead of just keeping them comfortable. Colonel Webb didn't recognize her. His eyes were unfocused, oxygen saturation probably low, the kind of cognitive fog that came from waiting too long in poor conditions. She moved toward the wheelchair without permission, without announcement, her hands finding the grip with the same certainty they'd find an artery in a combat situation. "I'm taking you upstairs," Katie said, her voice low and level, the kind of voice that made people listen without knowing why. "Room for 12. They should have done this hours ago." She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She turned the wheelchair and moved, smooth, precise, the way a person moves when pain is information and panic is a luxury they can't afford. The linoleum was cold under her shoes, and somewhere above them, the fluorescent lights buzzed like insects trapped in plastic. She could feel him trying to speak, the weak rasp of someone whose oxygen levels had been dropping for hours, but she didn't engage. There was work to do. There was always work to do. At the nurse's station on the 4th floor, Dr. Ashford was reviewing something on a tablet, his posture that particular kind of slouch that expensive education could not quite hide, the casual authority of a man who'd never had to fight for anything. His eyes lifted when Katie approached with the wheelchair, and something shifted in his expression. Not alarm. Not even concern. Something colder than that. A calculation. Dr. Ashford had been at Seattle General for 8 years, and in those 8 years he'd learned how to protect the things that mattered to him, his research time, which was 3 hours a day minimum, his clinical hours, which were minimal, his reputation for clinical excellence, built mostly on the work of residents and nurses who'd learned not to question his methods. This new hire, Rodriguez, with her hesitant demeanor and her tendency to speak up about patient wait times, she was already a problem. 2 incident reports in her first week about standard practices. Questions about admission backlogs that had been absorbing too many resources. Concerns about nurse-to-patient ratios on the night shift that had somehow made it to the nursing supervisor. The kind of quiet persistence that came from someone with a conscience instead of just a paycheck. He watched her settle Colonel Webb into the room, her movements efficient and precise in a way that suggested previous experience far beyond standard nursing practice. She checked his oxygen saturation, 84%, dangerously low, and adjusted his cannula without verbal instruction from him. She was already writing in the chart, noting the time he'd been waiting, documenting his vitals with the kind of specificity that would create a paper trail. Exactly the kind of thing that made people ask questions. "You're new," Dr. Ashford said, appearing in the doorway with the specific timing of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Not a question. A statement, offered in the tone of someone correcting an inconvenient fact about reality. Katie didn't turn immediately. She finished checking the 4-line, satisfied herself that the access was clean and secure, then straightened. When she met his eyes, her face showed nothing, not deference, not challenge, just the blank professionalism of someone doing their job. "Katie Rodriguez," she said quietly. 3 weeks in. Dr. Ashford nodded slowly, his gaze moving from her to the patient and back again, processing something in that calculated way. He was a tall man, the kind of tall that came with good posture and the certainty that other people would get out of his way. His hands were steady, unmarked by any kind of physical labor, the hands of a man who'd spent his professional life telling other people what to do. Colonel Webb was on the waiting list for this room, Dr. Ashford said, not in an explanatory way but in the tone of someone stating facts for a record. Standard admission protocol requires physician assignment before room placement. You moved him without consulting the charge nurse. Katie didn't blink. He waited for hours. 7 minutes per hospital policy before escalation. Policy, Dr. Ashford repeated, and smiled in that particular way that suggested he found the word amusing. "We're flexible with policy here, Ms. Rodriguez. We have to be. Resources are limited. We make decisions based on priority, not on emotion." He turned and walked away before she could respond, the kind of conversational exit that was designed to leave her with nothing but silence and the weight of his words. Behind him, Colonel Webb's oxygen saturation was already climbing, 87%, 89, 91, responding to the increased flow rate and the fact that he was finally lying flat instead of slumped in a wheelchair against a wall. Katie stayed until she was certain his vitals were stable, her hands moving through the standard checks with the kind of automatic competence that came from having done these things before, in places where making a mistake meant someone died. She didn't think about Dr. Ashford. She didn't think about the particular weight of his smile. She just did the work, the way she'd been trained to do it, the way she'd always done it, since she was a soldier and not just a nurse. But from the nurse's station, Dr. Ashford was making a note in his own tablet, not in the patient chart, but somewhere private, somewhere that documented concerns about judgment and protocol compliance. He'd already made the decision that this new hire would need to be managed carefully. She asked too many questions. She noticed things that weren't supposed to be noticed. She treated patient neglect like it was a problem that needed solving, instead of like it was simply the cost of doing business in a hospital that was perpetually understaffed and under-resourced. The night stretched ahead, and Katie moved through the corridors with the kind of quiet efficiency that nobody noticed. But Dr. Ashford was noticing. He was always noticing. He was noticing, and he was beginning to understand that this particular nurse was going to require a much more sophisticated approach than simple dismissal. The overhead page crackled at 7:34 a.m. during morning rounds, Dr. Ashford's voice smooth as polished marble through the speaker system. "Can Nurse Kathy handle a bedpan in 304, or should we send someone qualified?" Laughter rippled down the second-floor corridor like water finding cracks. Katie's hands didn't falter. She was changing an elderly patient's dressing, her movements precise and unhurried, the gauze unfolding without a tremor. One measured breath through her nose. In, out. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She finished securing the tape, patted Mrs. Chen's shoulder, and moved toward the door with the same steady pace she'd learned in a field hospital outside Sanjin, where screaming was a luxury nobody could afford. The other nurses pretended not to notice her passing. One of them actually looked away, guilty in a way that would have stung if Katie still let things sting. She didn't. Dr. Ashford stood at the nurse's station when she passed, his posture relaxed against the counter, smirking like a wolf showing its teeth. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. No flinch. No break. Just the flat stare of someone who'd held dying soldiers' hands while calling in air support. He looked away first. Day 7 came with the supply closet. Katie was restocking gauze, for X for S, 2X2S, rolls of Curlix in their tan packages, when the door closed behind her and Dr. Ashford's body filled the frame. No one else in the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. His voice dropped low, conversational, the kind of tone a snake might use when discussing the weather. You ask a lot of questions for someone on probation, Katie. Budget cuts are coming this fall. Significant cuts. Your file could reflect incompetence. Patient complaints. Maybe some medication errors that I personally witnessed during your shifts. The shelves pressed against her back. Boxes of gloves stacked 7 high. She could smell the bleach from the mop bucket outside, acidic and sharp. Katie counted to 3. Slow. The old way. I document everything, doctor. Every medication. Every order. Every conversation. His smile widened. The predator was enjoying this. And who do you think the board believes? The physician with 12 years of institutional credibility, or the night nurse with the limp who can barely handle her basic assignments? The word hung there like a blade. The limp. He'd been noticing the way her left leg bore less weight on bad nights, the way she favored her right side during 12-hour shifts. The limp was her tells, and he'd been watching for tells all week. She took one measured breath. That's when the tear came, one escape that surprised them both. She wiped it away slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving his. I've survived worse than you, sir. Not a plea. A statement of fact, delivered like testimony. She stepped around him, her shoulder brushing his arm deliberately, and left the supply closet carrying the weight of his stare against her back like a physical thing. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't need to. Day 9 arrived in the parking lot at 6:53 a.m., that strange hour when the night shift was collapsing toward their cars and the day shift was climbing out of them like soldiers emerging from a bunker. Katie's hand was already shaking, exhaustion, for 12-hour shifts in a row, the accumulated fatigue of being watched, when Dr. Ashford intercepted her beside her 2007 Honda Civic, his voice carrying across the asphalt loud enough for the arriving nurses to hear. 3 of them stopped by the entrance, coffee cups steaming in the cool morning air. Rodriguez, effective immediately, you're reassigned to overnight custodial support. The clinical environment requires steadier personnel. He was reading from nothing, performing for the audience he'd manufactured. Your patient care duties are suspended. Janitorial only. Report to maintenance supervisor at 1900 hours. Katie's hand trembled on her car door handle. Not from fear. From restraint. The kind of trembling that happens when a soldier stands at parade rest with a loaded weapon and no target. One tear tracked down her cheek, not weakness, just the body's automatic response to adrenaline and injustice, and she wiped it away slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact. The other nurses watched. Dr. Ashford waited for her to crumble, to apologize, to ask for another chance like every other nurse he'd dismantled over the years. She slid into her car instead. Her voice came through the open window, low enough that only he could hear it, but her eyes were level with his. I've cleaned up worse messes than you can imagine, Doctor. She closed the door. The engine turned over. She pulled out of the spot while he turned to the watching nurses with a satisfied nod, his hands in his pockets, looking for all the world like a man who'd just won. He had no idea what he'd just done. He had no idea what he'd just woken up. That night, Katie worked her first custodial shift in silence. The mop in her hands felt wrong, the handle too thin compared to the weight she'd carried in Helmand Province, but her shoulders remembered the motion. Push, pull, ring, repeat. The third floor at 2 a.m. was a graveyard masquerading as a hospital wing. The skeleton crew was 2 nurses for 16 patients, both of them drowning in admit paperwork and for troubleshooting. She mopped past Colonel Webb's room and saw his call light had been burning for 43 minutes. The number came to her automatically. She'd been watching the clock since 1:17 a.m., the way soldiers watch clocks. The monitor visible through his partial open door showed irregular vitals that made her chest tighten. Atrial fibrillation. Not dangerous yet, but approaching the edge of dangerous. She could keep walking. Could prop her mop against the wall and leave it there, stay invisible like the discharge paperwork from Fort Bragg had instructed her to do. Invisible. Unremarkable. Forgotten. Just a nurse, her commanding officer had written in the recommendation letter. Nothing more. She hesitated for exactly 4 seconds, then props her mop against the doorframe and entered his room anyway. Colonel Webb was awake, his eyes tracking her movement with the sharp focus of someone accustomed to command. His hospital gown hung loose from shoulders that had carried ruck marches and weight and the responsibility of men's lives. "I know you," he said quietly. Not a question. Recognition. Sanjin. The court-martial. You were Major Catherine Rodriguez. The rank landed like an impact round. Major. No one had called her that in 3 years. Her hands moved to his full line, muscle memory taking over, checking the infiltration the day's shift had missed. The catheter had shifted 48 hours ago. She could see the swelling around the insertion point just from looking at his wrist. She should call the nurse. That was protocol. That was the job of someone who pushed a mop. "I'll get your nurse," she said, her voice steady as surgical steel. "You are a nurse," he responded. The clarity in his voice was absolute. "And I was wrong about you. I reviewed that patrol footage 6 months after your discharge. The report I received was falsified. Your CO fabricated the casualty timeline and the rules of engagement. You saved my life that day under fire." Her hands froze on the 4-pole. The world had a strange way of rearranging itself when you weren't paying attention. "That doesn't change anything, sir." "It changes everything, Major." She flinched at the rank, the way it landed like shrapnel. "Don't call me that. I clean floors now." She adjusted his pillows with the same efficiency she once used on trauma casualties, tucking the cotton carefully around his shoulders, and that's when the words came out before she could stop them, dry, exhausted, carrying the weight of 3 years of invisible work. "I'm going on break after this. Need some Jell-O?" The faintest shadow of a smile crossed his face. She left before he could respond, before the past could crack through the walls she'd spent 36 months building brick by brick. Dr. Ashford reviewed the security footage the next morning at 8:15 a.m., a coffee cup steaming beside his keyboard. The timestamp read 2:11 a.m. Katie in Webb's room for 4 minutes. Checking vitals. Adjusting pillows. The movements were too practiced. Too confident. He made 3 phone calls before noon, first to the board chairman's assistant, mentioning budget constraints and the new hire's inappropriate presence on restricted floors, second to hospital legal about liability and scope creep, third to the maintenance supervisor to ensure Katie worked alone on the 4th floor where Webb's room had just been moved. The machinery of institutional power was a beautiful thing when you understood how to move it, and Dr. Ashford had spent 12 years learning the buttons, the levers, the precise pressure points. But that wasn't the worst part of what he'd just set in motion. The mop bucket water had turned grey somewhere around 2 in the morning. Katie Rodriguez wrung out the strands with mechanical precision, her limp more pronounced now after 8 hours on her feet, the janitorial closet on the 4th floor of Seattle General smelling like industrial bleach and the particular staleness of fluorescent-lit air that hadn't moved since sundown. The night shift skeleton crew was thin, 2 nurses covering 23 beds, 1 resident sleeping in the call room, Dr. Ashford somewhere in his office calculating margins and billing codes. She'd stopped existing to most of them by 11 p.m. That was the point, she understood now. Invisible was safer. Invisible meant no more overhead pages, no more reassignments, no more of his cold smile when she passed the nurse's station. The mop handle was smooth under her palms, worn by thousands of identical passes across identical tile. She could do this in her sleep. She'd done harder things on less sleep in places where the floor was blood instead of water. The 3rd floor corridor stretched toward Webb's room as she moved the cart down the hallway, the fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical prayer. Most of the doors were closed. The ones open showed patients in the blue-gray darkness of hospital night, monitors blinking their vital reassurances. She kept her head down and her movements efficient, the way people move when they've learned not to take up space. But as she passed room 447, something made her pause. The water pitcher on Webb's bedside table sat at an angle, and she could hear something that didn't fit the usual nighttime hospital sounds. Not the steady rhythm of a sleeping man. Something labored. Something wrong. Katie stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, long enough for the old training to surface through the new invisibility. Colonel Marcus Webb was awake, his wheelchair positioned beside his bed, and he was reaching for his water pitcher with the jerky, desperate movements of someone whose body was already sending distress signals his mind hadn't fully processed yet. His fingers fell short by inches. He tried again. The pitcher wobbled. She moved without thinking. The mop handle leaned against the wall beside his door. Her hands were already inside his room, already reaching for the pitcher, already setting it within reach on his overbed table, when the rational part of her brain, the part that had learned to survive by following rules, caught up. She was custodial. She was not supposed to be in patient rooms unless assigned by housekeeping. She was definitely not supposed to touch anything a patient might need. Colonel Webb's eyes met hers in the darkness, and for a moment neither of them moved. She saw recognition flicker across his face, a moment of confusion, then something like calculation, the same expression he'd worn when signing her discharge papers in Sanjin 7 years ago. Then he nodded slightly, and she turned to leave, but his breathing had changed. It was sharper now. Faster. The breath of a man whose lungs were beginning to betray him. Katie moved back into his room and let the door close softly behind her. She'd spent 19 months commanding a Special Forces medical unit in Helmand Province. She knew the sound of respiratory distress the way other people knew their own heartbeat. Webb's was climbing into something acute. "Colonel," she said, her voice dropping into the register she'd trained out of herself for weeks. "When did this start?" "Just now." His words came between breaths, each one slightly more shallow than the last. "I was sleeping. Woke up. Chest feels tight. Can't quite." He paused, struggling for a full breath. "Can't quite get enough air." The alarm bells in her combat-trained brain were screaming now. Acute onset. Chest tightness. Shortness of breath. Respiratory rate already elevated, she could count them visually, each one more rapid than the last. 32. 33. She'd seen this before. Not in a hospital. In a burning Humvee outside Sanjin with shrapnel in her femur and Webb's driver screaming as the flames crawled up the vehicle's frame. "I'm getting help," Katie said, and she hit the call button twice, the signal for code blue. The buttons on hospital call systems were designed for fingers that still worked reliably. Webb's were trembling now, his jaw clenched against the sensation of his body shutting down, oxygen saturation falling like an elevator with a severed cable. She could see it in the way his lips were beginning to darken at the edges, that subtle shift from pink to something deeper, something wrong. Cyanosis. The word clinical, the reality terrifying. The overhead paging system crackled to life, the operator's voice flat and practiced, "Code blue, 4th floor, room 447. Code blue, 4th floor, room for 47. Katie moved to Webb's side, her hands already running the assessment she'd performed hundreds of times on soldiers who'd taken IED fragments and sniper rounds and secondary explosions that collapsed their lungs from the inside out. Respiratory rate pushing 36 now. Heart rate elevated, she could see the pulse in his neck jumping like machinery under stress. His skin was cool, clammy, the way skin gets when the body is diverting blood away from the periphery to protect the core. Every clinical detail screamed massive pulmonary embolism, a blood clot had broken free somewhere and lodged in his lungs, and his body was in the final stages of a cascade that would end in cardiac arrest if something didn't reverse it in the next few minutes. "Stay with me, Colonel," Katie said, and she positioned herself to monitor his airway, keeping her voice level the way you keep your voice level when soldiers are bleeding out and you're the only one who can stop it. "Help's coming." The room remained empty. The code blue alert had gone out at 3:17 a.m., and Seattle General was running on fumes and caffeine at that hour. Dr. Chen was 3 floors down in the ER managing a motor vehicle accident. The resident in the call room was 40 seconds away if he was awake. The 2 nurses covering the 4th floor were managing 2 critical patients already. Katie knew the hospital's architecture now, knew the delays built into the system, knew how long it took for a code team to assemble when the night shift was skeleton crew thin. Webb's oxygen saturation was dropping in real time now. 72%. The pulse oximeter on his finger screamed its high-pitched alarm, a sound like a small animal dying. His lips were definitely blue now, not the shadows of cyanosis but actual color change, the kind that meant his blood was carrying less oxygen than his brain required to stay conscious. His eyes were still locked on hers, still tracking, still aware, and in them she saw something that transcended the hierarchy between retired colonel and former major. She saw a man who knew what was happening and understood exactly what she was facing. The code cart was in the hallway. Policy said she couldn't touch it. Policy said a custodial nurse was outside her scope, outside her authority, outside her right to intervene. Policy was written by people who'd never had to choose between following rules and watching someone die. Dr. Ashford had made sure of that choice specifically. He'd demoted her to janitorial work so when this moment came, and he'd clearly anticipated that she would have no legal standing, no authorization, no protection. The alarm screamed again. 70%. Webb's fingers were gripping the bed rail now with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a rope that's already slipping through his fingers. She could hear footsteps in the hallway, the sound of the code team assembling, but they were still 20 seconds away. Maybe 30. The human brain can survive without oxygen for 4 to 6 minutes before permanent damage begins. Webb was already at the threshold. Katie's hand moved to the crash cart outside his door. She didn't decide. Her hands did. The hands that had held compression bandages against arterial wounds, that had performed emergency cricothyrotomies with a cricothyroid knife on soldiers whose tracheas were collapsing, that had stitched field training exercises on living tissue in a field hospital where anesthesia was a luxury and speed was the only mercy available. The hands remembered what the official Katie was supposed to forget. She pulled the cart into the room. The equipment inside was modern, but the principles were ancient. She needed a decompression needle. 14 gauge. She found it in the trauma drawer, her fingers knew exactly where, had known before her conscious mind caught up. Somewhere in the hallway, she heard Dr. Ashford's voice calling for a status update, already calculating, already understanding that something was happening outside his control. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomical landmark where a needle could penetrate directly into the pleural space and collapse the tension pneumothorax that was suffocating Webb from the inside. Except this wasn't a tension pneumothorax. This was a massive pulmonary embolism, which a needle wouldn't fix. What she could do was buy time. What she could do was buy enough minutes for the code team to arrive with a Reboa balloon catheter, with medications, with the resources of an actual trauma unit instead of a single nurse and a man she'd sworn she was done saving. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Ashford was standing in the doorway now, watching her hand position the needle, watching her break every protocol he'd carefully constructed to ensure she would have no legal standing when she did exactly this. His eyes were cold as surgical steel, and he was already composing the charges in his mind: unauthorized practice, scope violation, patient endangerment. He'd anticipated this. He'd set up this moment like a snare. Katie's hands kept moving anyway. The crash came at 3:17 a.m. A water pitcher hitting linoleum. Then Webb's gasping, the sound of a man drowning in air, each breath a ragged pull through a closing throat. Katie heard it from the supply closet 2 rooms down, the noise cutting through the hum of fluorescent lights like a scalpel through silk. She moved before her brain caught up to her body. Webb's room. Door open. He was upright in bed, his wheelchair abandoned beside the nightstand, his good hand clawing at his chest while his face darkened from pink to purple to something the color of a bruise. Oxygen saturation monitor screaming, 68. 64. The numbers falling like a plane losing altitude. Get me heparin. 16-gauge needle. High flow O2. Now. Katie's voice cut through the fog like a command from someone who'd given orders before. The night nurse, a terrified kid named Marcus who was still learning which end of the stethoscope went in your ears, stood frozen in the doorway. Did I stutter? She didn't wait for an answer. Her hands moved like they had a memory separate from her mind. Sanjin, 2018. A field hospital outside the city limits. A Marine with his chest caved in, gasping just like this, and Katie with nothing but her training and her will standing between him and the ceiling. The trembling wasn't fear. It was muscle memory. Webb's oxygen sat at 61 now. The panic in his eyes was a mirror of something she'd seen before, that particular kind of terror that comes from your own body becoming a trap. She grabbed the crash cart with one hand and his wrist with the other. Colonel! Look at me. Look at my eyes. You're not dying tonight. Tension pneumothorax, she said to Marcus, who was finally moving. His lungs collapsed. Air's trapped between the visceral and parietal pleura, compressing the heart. Every breath makes it worse. She'd had an emergency field kit in her locker for 3 years, a habit from her discharge that Dr. Ashford had never bothered to ask about. MRE packaging in her jacket pocket right now, still crisp from when she'd grabbed it out of her car last week, muscle memory telling her she might need it. Hands that had held lives together in the dust outside Sanjin didn't unlearn that lesson just because she wore scrubs now instead of body armor. The corridor stayed empty. Skeleton crew. 2 nurses on the whole floor, and Marcus was useless with panic vibrating through him like a tuning fork. Katie's hands moved on their own. She prepped Webb's chest, fingers finding the landmarks with the precision that came from having done this in worse light, under fire, with rounds snapping overhead and blood slicking everything. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle was already in her hand. What are you doing? Dr. Ashford's voice. He was standing in the doorway, still in yesterday's clothes, his face the careful blank of a man calculating something. He'd been in the hospital. Of course he had. Always watching. Always circling. Katie didn't answer. She couldn't afford to. Webb saturation was at 58 now. The hiss of air escaping the needle was the only sound that mattered. That sharp, precise hiss that meant air was leaving the space around his lung, meant pressure was dropping, meant his heart could beat again without something crushing it flat. Step away from that patient, Rodriguez. You are not authorized. Dr. Ashford moved toward her, his hand up like he could physically stop what was already happening. Then you do it, doctor. Katie's voice had changed. It had dropped an octave somewhere between the hallway and Webb's bedside, had picked up the weight of someone who'd given orders to enlisted men, who'd made decisions that meant the difference between going home and a flag-folded notification. He's got a tension pneumothorax developing, and unless you want to decompress it, I suggest you let me work. Webb's O2 was climbing. 64. 70. The color returning to his face like someone had turned up the saturation on a photograph. His breathing eased, the panic draining from his eyes, replaced by something like recognition, like he'd just realized who was standing over him, and what that meant. The code team arrived at 3:19 a.m., running like they'd heard the alarm in their sleep, which they had. Dr. Chen from the ER took over without needing an explanation, her eye scanning the scene, Katie's hand steady, Webb stabilizing numbers, the needle decompression that had probably saved his life in the 2 minutes before medical could arrive. "Good work," she said to Katie. Just 2 words, but they landed like a salute. Katie stepped back. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline coursing through her body in waves, her legs suddenly aware that they'd been holding her up through something impossible. She'd just performed an unauthorized procedure. She'd just given orders to a senior physician. She'd just made herself a target. Dr. Ashford waited. That was the thing that made her skin crawl. He didn't argue with Dr. Chen. Didn't try to overrule the code team. Didn't make a scene. He just watched, his face perfectly composed, perfectly empty, like he was making notes for later. Like he was learning her weaknesses so he could use them. Webb stabilized at 3:23 a.m. Oxygen saturation holding at 92. Heart rate dropping from the panicked 128 to something almost reasonable. The team moved him to the ICU with protocols and procedures, and Katie fading back into the background where she belonged, where she'd been taught to belong, where she'd spent the last 2 years learning to be invisible. Dr. Ashford found her at 3:38 a.m. in the corridor outside Webb's room. His voice was quiet, which was worse than if he'd yelled. Quiet voices made permanent decisions. "My office. Now." The office was cold. Everything in Dr. Ashford's office was expensive and cold, the kind of furniture that cost money but offered no comfort, the kind of room designed to remind you that you were small. He had papers already spread across his desk when she walked in. Termination papers. He'd prepared them in advance, which meant he'd known, which meant this had been a trap all along. "Unauthorized medical procedure," he said, sliding the papers toward her like he was dealing cards at a very specific kind of poker game. "Abandonment of assigned duties. Insubordination. Practicing medicine outside your scope of practice." Katie picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. That was the thing about having your worst day already happen to you, everything after that was just variations on the same theme. "You were demoted to janitorial services, Rodriguez. Your job was to clean." He leaned back in his chair, and she could see him relax, could see the moment he understood that she wasn't going to fight this. That made it easier for him. That made it feel like a victory. That job didn't include making medical decisions. It didn't include challenging attending physicians. It certainly didn't include performing procedures that could have harmed the patient. She signed the first page without reading it. Her legal signature, the one from before, the one tied to a name that meant something in rooms she no longer had access to. "Security will escort you out. You're finished here." He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting a long time to say that sentence. "Your badge is revoked as of this moment." The locker room was empty at 4:07 a.m. Katie opened her locker and pulled out her jacket, the same jacket she'd worn on her last deployment, the one with the patch sewn into the lining. The faded unit patch from 3rd Special Forces Group, stitched there by her own hands the night before her medical discharge, a secret she'd kept pressed against her ribs for 3 years. She traced her fingers across it like it was a rosary, like muscle memory alone could bring back the person she used to be. She didn't cry in the locker room. She wouldn't give him that. She didn't cry in her car. She didn't cry driving through the rain that had started sometime around 3 a.m., the kind of rain that makes Norfolk feel like the end of the world. She didn't cry until she was kneeling in front of a gravestone at Riverside Cemetery, the headstone dark with rain, the name carved deep, Miguel Santos Rodriguez, 1989 to 2018. Marine. Husband. The man who told her, the night before he died, to be invisible, to let the world pass over her without noticing, to survive by being so small that nobody could hurt her. "I tried," she whispered to the stone. The rain hammered down like applause. I tried to be invisible like you said, M.I. more. I tried to let it all go. But I couldn't. I couldn't watch him die. I couldn't just stand there and let someone die when I could. She stopped. Breathed. Finished it anyway. When I could save him. Her fingers traced his name, and underneath it she traced the place on her own thigh where the shrapnel had gone in, where the scar tissue still pulled when it rained. Same firefight. Same day. Different outcomes. He'd gotten a flag-folded box and a burial detail. She'd gotten a medical discharge and a job pushing mops in a hospital hallway. I saved the man who court-martialed me, she said to the rain, to the stone, to the part of herself that had died in the same moment Miguel had, and lost everything anyway. The Black Hawk arrived at 1,400 hours on a Thursday. 3 days later, its rotor wash rattling every window in Seattle General like someone was shaking the whole building to see what fell out. The noise brought staff running to the windows. That particular sound meant something was wrong, meant someone was hurt, meant a medical emergency dropping from the sky. But this Black Hawk wasn't carrying a patient. This one was carrying consequences. 2 Army Rangers in full dress uniform strode through the main entrance at 1,403 hours, their boots echoing on tile in a rhythm that made people step back without being asked. Dress blues that fit like they'd been tailored for war, ribbons that told stories of places most people only saw in documentaries, and the particular bearing of men who didn't ask permission because they'd long since stopped believing they needed it. The receptionist tried. She actually tried. You can't just. Major Catherine Rodriguez, the lead ranger said. His name tape read Holloway, and his voice had the weight of command behind it. Call sign, Valkyrie 6. We need her current location. Now. The corridor froze. People stopped mid-stride. Someone dropped a tablet, and the sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. Dr. Ashford emerged from his office, his face carefully assembled into something professional and innocent. I'm afraid there's no one here by that. She was terminated 3 days ago. Holloway cut him off, pulling out his phone with the efficiency of someone who'd already called ahead, who already knew the answer before he asked the question. I need her current address. Now. Not a request, Doctor. Not a suggestion. Colonel Webb appeared at the end of the corridor, pushing himself up from a wheelchair with hands that trembled but held, his face still bearing the marks of someone who'd come very close to not making it. That nurse saved my life twice, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a debt unpaid and a truth finally spoken out loud. Once in Sanjin when she pulled me from a burning MRAP under fire while taking shrapnel in her leg. Once last week when your entire staff left me to die in a hallway. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that changed things. A young nurse near the reception desk, the same one who'd frozen when Webb coded, pulled up a personnel file on her tablet with shaking hands. Her voice came out small and terrified and awestruck. Catherine Maria Rodriguez, Major, United States Army Special Forces. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart, 18 months commanding 3rd Special Forces Group Medical Unit in Sanjin District. She couldn't finish. Her voice broke on the last word like someone had reached down her throat. A SEAL team leader stepped forward from behind the Rangers. He was still in tactical pants from training, his chest bearing the marks of men who worked for a living, his face the weathered brown of someone who spent time in places the sun was trying to kill you. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something heavier than gratitude. Major Rodriguez held our position for 6 hours under direct fire in June 2019, he said to the assembled staff, but his eyes were on Dr. Ashford. She performed 3 field amputations. Extracted my entire squad when we were pinned down. She carried my sergeant 2 miles with a shattered femur. A pause, just long enough for the weight to sink in. The woman you fired is a legend. Dr. Ashford's face drained of color. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. There were policy violations. She exceeded her. An FBI agent in a dark suit appeared at the entrance, credentials already in hand, another agent moving up behind him with the particular stance of someone about to make an arrest. Dr. James Ashford, the lead agent said. We've been investigating you for 4 weeks. Falsified performance reviews to cover patient neglect. Altered medical records. Forged duty logs to discredit Nurse Rodriguez when her incident reports threatened your research grant funding. Webb's eyes found the point in the corridor where Katie had pushed his wheelchair. Where she'd stayed with him. Where she'd broken every rule to save him. She cleared her locker in silence. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge above her as she pulled the last of her belongings, 3 pairs of compression socks, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, a photo of her husband in his marine dress blues, and placed them into a canvas bag. Her name had already been scrubbed from the duty roster. Her badge access revoked with a single keystroke. The locker door swung shut with a hollow click that sounded like a coffin lid closing. The rain hammered the parking lot like accusations as she walked out into the Norfolk evening. Her beat-up Subaru waited in the back row, and she didn't hesitate. She knew exactly where she needed to go. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 2 and 10, the same position she'd held a rifle trigger for 18 months in Helmand Province. The same position that had saved 7 soldiers in a burning Humvee outside San Jin while rounds tore through the roof. Riverside Cemetery sat at the edge of the city, ancient oaks bent like old men over weathered stones. She pulled in at 8:19 p.m. and walked without an umbrella, letting the rain soak through her scrubs. Her limp was more pronounced now, the femur fracture from that same firefight aching with the damp. Everything came back to that day. Everything. The grave marker was simple granite. James Rodriguez, 1989 to 2012. Husband. Marine. Hero. Below his name, the inscription she'd chosen, he gave everything so others could live. She knelt on the wet grass, her jeans soaking up the cemetery's cold. The rain streaked her face and she made no move to wipe it away. I tried to be invisible like you said, M.I. Amor, she whispered to the stone. I tried to keep my head down, do my job, be small enough that nobody noticed me. I tried to be the person you told me to be that last time we talked. Her voice cracked on the edge of something dangerous. But I failed again. She reached into her jacket and found the faded patch, 3rd Special Forces Group, the stitching worn nearly invisible by time and fingers that had touched it 1,000 times. The last piece of the major she used to be. The last piece of the woman James had married in that tiny ceremony at Camp Lejeune, before the deployments, before the wars turned her into something harder than steel and just as cold. The patch felt like a confession. She stayed there for 20 minutes, rain and tears indistinguishable on her face, the cemetery so quiet she could hear the individual drops hitting the leaves. When she finally stood, her knees protested like they always did. She traced the gravestone with her fingertips, the way a blind person reads a face, and whispered 3 words in Spanish before turning to walk back to her car. 3 days. That's how long the world took to arrive. The Black Hawk landed on Seattle General's rooftop helipad at 6:14 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, rotors screaming like something ancient and furious. The sound shook the windows on 6 floors. Night shift nurses looked up from their charts. Residents froze mid-conversation. The helicopter settled with the precision of a predator landing on prey, and before the rotors finished slowing, the doors opened. 2 Army Rangers stepped onto the tarmac in full tactical gear, the kind of men who moved through the world like the air pressure changed when they entered a room. They didn't run. They didn't hurry. But they covered distance as if gravity bent differently for them. Inside, on the administrative wing where Dr. Ashford kept his office with its mahogany desk and his framed medical degree from Johns Hopkins, the Rangers walked straight past the bewildered administrative assistant and the security guard who was already reaching for his phone. "We're looking for Major Catherine Rodriguez," the first Ranger said, his voice like gravel rolling in a tin can. "She goes by Valkyrie 6. This hospital has 30 seconds to produce her." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Dr. Ashford emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion, and the color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. The Ranger's eyes moved across the corridor, taking in the hospital administrator, the nursing director, the confusion written in quicksand across everyone's features. "Who," the Ranger asked with surgical precision, "suspended this officer?" Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless hum. Colonel Marcus Webb appeared in a wheelchair at the end of the corridor, pushed by a young orderly who had no idea what was about to unfold. Webb's hands were steady on the armrests as he struggled to his feet, his body still weak but his will pulling him upright with the force of gravity reversed. "That nurse saved my life twice," Webb's voice carried the weight of command, despite his tremor. "Once in Sanjin when she pulled me from a burning Humvee under fire. Once last week when everyone else left me to die in a hallway at this hospital." The room went dead silent. A Ranger lieutenant stepped forward with a printed document, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from the kind of reverence that comes from standing in the presence of something sacred. He began to read, each word deliberate as a hammer strike. "Bronze star with Valor. The paws stretched like rope. Purple heart." Ashford's jaw clenched. His fingers curled into fists. "Another purple heart." The lieutenant looked up, his eyes moving across the assembled staff. 18 months commanding the 3rd Special Forces Group Medical Element in Helmand Province. Deadliest district in Afghanistan. Citation reads, "Under sustained fire, Major Rodriguez established a forward aid station with resources intended for half her personnel, triaging and treating 247 combat casualties while simultaneously directing close air support and coordinating casualty evacuation. Her decisions to prioritize life over protocol saved 7 soldiers who would otherwise have been lost." Then a Navy SEAL team leader stepped forward, tall, scarred, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved from titanium. "I served under her in 2011, he said quietly. "My squad was cut off, ambushed, 3 men down. She extracted us under enemy fire using an improvised chest seal from an MRE package because we were out of standard equipment. That improvisation kept Petty Officer Hayes alive for the helicopter ride. He has 2 kids now." Dr. Ashford's face had gone from white to gray to the color of old bone. The FBI agent arrived then, walking in with the casual certainty of someone who already owned every card in the deck. She held up a badge, nodded to the Ranger lieutenant, and looked directly at Dr. Ashford. "Your deleted emails were recovered from the hospital server," she said, her voice crisp as frosted glass. "Including the one where you instructed staff to delay Colonel Webb's admission to avoid overtime costs. The texts arranging to move him to an isolated floor where Major Rodriguez was assigned to custodial duties, specifically so you could document her violating protocols if she intervened. 16 patient files altered in 6 months. 3 harassment complaints fabricated against nurses who questioned your clinical decisions. Termination documentation forged with false medication errors she never committed." She pulled out a laptop. Security footage played on a screen mounted on the wall. 3:14 a.m., Dr. Ashford moving Colonel Webb's call button cord out of reach before leaving the room. 3 minutes later, Webb's oxygen saturation plummeted. The code team response delayed because the patient couldn't call for help. Hospital security shifted their weight. The board chairman appeared in the hallway, his face tight with the expression of someone watching his institution's reputation collapse. "Dr. Robert Ashford," the FBI agent said, producing handcuffs with the finality of a judge's gavel. "You're under arrest for federal fraud, falsification of medical records, and obstruction of justice." The cuffs clicked around his wrists like period markers at the end of a sentence. "This is ridiculous," Ashford finally found his voice, but it cracked like dry paint. "I've served this hospital for 12 years. You're going to believe some washed-up soldier who couldn't hack it in the real world." The Ranger lieutenant stepped forward. His eyes met Ashford's, and the temperature in the corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That major commanded more lives before breakfast than you'll treat in your career. She performed battlefield surgery while you were sleeping through grand rounds." Ashford was walked out through the main lobby in handcuffs, past patients and visitors, his carefully constructed authority dissolving with each step. Cameras flashed from local news crews alerted by the military helicopter. The board chairman was already on his cell phone, leaving voicemail after voicemail at a number he didn't have, Katie's number, which she still hadn't answered. 6 months later, Katie pushed Colonel Webb's wheelchair down a strip mall in Norfolk, her slight limp the only remaining evidence of the femur fracture that should have ended her. Her shoulders were squared now, the weight of invisibility finally lifted. The faded 3rd Special Forces group patch was displayed openly on her jacket shoulder, no longer hidden in the lining, no longer a confession whispered at a grave. Dr. Ashford sat at a folding table beneath a banner reading Cut Rate Insurance, Affordable Rates. His dress shirt was wrinkled. His tie hung loose. A stack of flyers sat in front of him, mostly untouched. He looked up as they passed and his face went pale with recognition. Katie didn't slow down. She didn't acknowledge him. She kept pushing Webb's chair forward, past the coffee shop, past the dry cleaners, toward the VA Medical Center 3 blocks away. The message was clear: he no longer deserved her attention. His consequences were his own. They entered the VA Center where Katie now ran the combat medic training program, her office wall covered with commendations and a photograph of James in his marine dress blues. Young medics snapped to attention when she entered, calling her Major with genuine respect, not the deference they'd offered the quiet new nurse, but the absolute authority of soldiers acknowledging a commander. Webb wheeled himself to the observation window overlooking the training floor where a young corpsman practiced the improvised chest seal technique, the one Katie had invented in a burning Humvee, the one that saved lives when everything else failed. "You're training them the real way," Webb observed. "The way that keeps them alive when everything goes wrong," Katie responded. "Not the way that looks good on paper." She placed her hand on his shoulder. His skin was warm, his presence solid as stone. "You gave me my rank back when you told them the truth, sir. I won't waste it again." Webb covered her hand with his, and they stood there in silence, watching the next generation of soldiers learn the language of survival. Through the window behind them, Norfolk moved on, including a strip mall where a disgraced doctor tried to sell insurance to people who walked past without seeing him. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, or if you've ever had to bite your tongue while the world got it wrong, hit subscribe. Because the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding everything together. Drop a comment: would you have walked away from Ashford in that parking lot, or would you have said something? And like this video, let's show YouTube that stories about hidden strength matter.